Hey everyone, welcome. I would say it every week in various ways, but like that intro is probably the calmest and most calm-inducing countdown timer in the history of countdown timers, and it just puts me in a good mood.
Me
Hey Lo,
too.
how's it
I love
going?
it. I'm good. I know. I love that intro. The last time I was on, I was like, this is so great.
Just kind of like you get to kind of chill to it, and I like the idea of our streams being very chill streams, and so I
Yes.
dig it. For our returning viewers, if there are any of you in the audience, you might notice we are without our lovely Tim Bennix today. Tim is actually in Amsterdam right now. Tomorrow morning, Amsterdam time, he's going on stage to rock the Vue.js Amsterdam stage, which is very exciting. And I'm looking forward to seeing the video of it. I will not be awake for it. And Lo, I assume you won't be
Yeah.
awake for it either, but I'm
No,
excited.
but I think it's going to be awesome. It's 9, right? Central Europe time,
Yep,
9
9
a.m.
a.m. Vue.js Amsterdam, and it is the stage for Vue.js Amsterdam is this giant like curved screen that's like literally takes up the entirety of the stage, and Tim has 3 browsers worth of content to put across the stage, and it's the most they've ever used it, and I got to see a
Oh,
demo of it,
it's going to be so
and
great.
it's super cool. I like it a lot, and we're actually going to do in the coming weeks. I don't know exactly when, but we're gonna break it down, all of Tim's setup for it, because there's a lot of really interesting tech that he's not going to have an opportunity on stage to like really go into. So we're gonna break it down. He's using HighGraph for a little bit of it. All the content's powered by HighGraph, and then there's Supabase and obviously Nuxt, I think, and some other stuff going on
Yeah.
in there. So it's really cool. So look for that on our channel here in the coming weeks. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's next week or the week after. We'll see how he feels after the conference for when he wants to do that. But yeah, today we're going to talk about, I think, something not as cool, but like super important, and that's content modeling. Lo, it seems like we bring you on for the not so cool but super important topics. You came on for multi-tenancy, which is not cool at all, but like when you need it, it's real important.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, that's kind of my brand if I have one, right? Like the not so cool thing. But I try to make it fun along the way because I think that, like, a lot of times these things that we think about that are really kind of hidden in infrastructure things, they get glossed over, but they're super important in terms of they help you be able to do all the cool things, right?
Absolutely. Like my favorite thing is, you glossed over the secondary thing that I said, right? Like the not super cool, but super important. And
Yeah.
I think content modeling, which is what we're going to talk about today, the nice thing is, as opposed to like multi-tenancy, which you talked about last time you were on, is that everything needs this, right? Like you don't always need
Yes.
multi-tenancy, but content modeling is everything. So what is content modeling? Let's start with the definition there.
So when we think about content modeling, right, we can really just sort of boil it down to it is like a map or blueprint of what your content is, right? And your team and how that all works together, right? So it defines the types and the structures and really sort of gives the sort of structure, if you will, of your content. It describes like what kind of content you want to store, and more importantly, how that content relates to each other, and how it's going to be and can be edited in your system. So it is really sort of when we think about a full content model, not just a single model. So meaning all of your content, right? It is really the map of how everything pieces together, and not just how the actual content itself pieces together, but how all of your teams and maybe your business goal and organization is pieced together through this model. And they can be very simple or they can be very complex.
And I think that there's an interesting thing that you're talking about there, where we're developers, right? Like the two of us are developers. Many of the people who might be tuning in developers, HighGraph is a very dev-centric product in a lot of ways, but the content model defines our API. Like in any system that has content modeling built in, it will define your API. But it also, in most of these systems, in most headless CMSs, that inextricably ties it to the editor experience as well. And so when we're thinking about
Yes.
figuring out what works for the API, figuring out what works for the editor, they have to work together. Because if you build a great API but a crappy editor experience, your editors will start working outside the system. And if you put together a great editor experience but it's a really bad API, then the same thing happens on the developer side as well.
Right. And, something you said, like a poor content model or content model that isn't thoughtful in the way that it considers all of these things will end up being a bad experience for everyone involved.
Yep. So one of the things we're going to do today, which in fairness, we came up with the idea yesterday, is we're going to explore the web.dev site, which is, if you're a web developer, you're probably familiar with, maybe you're not. It is almost like a direct competitor, if there is a competitor in this space, to like an MDN, right? It's not like the full reference stuff that Mozilla Developer Network created, but it is around learning web technology. And it's actually a very deep and differentiated content experience. So we thought about like, oh, we could do e-commerce, but like, everyone's got that. And like we see kind of the same things over and over again. So let's do a content site. And so I feel like we're going to break this down. We'll build some of the model inside of HighGraph, but really we need to talk philosophically about a lot of it. We need to talk like how this all works together, because if I were to have received this design, these are the types of things that we would need to think about when breaking a design into content models as well. So yeah, as intros go, I think we're there. But like, let's take a look a little bit at the web.dev homepage, and let's start thinking about that. So I guess let's scroll down and Lo, let's talk about what we kind of see in terms of content. I'm going to skip over this entire header area, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
It has its own interesting bits we'd have to worry about in terms of content model, but I think the meat of what we might want to talk about, right,
Yes.
is
Let's
starting
get into
down here.
this.
So as we come down, we're like immediately presented with content, right? Like most websites are content, and we have a headline and some text. And so when we're thinking about this, where does this come from? What do we need to worry ourselves about?
Right. So this is what we're looking at is basically something like like when we think of like heroes, right? So it's like a hero component. So I would imagine that all of these different these types come together as a unit in like a hero component. So you have an image, you have a title, you have what is like a body or a little bit of text, and then you have a button, right? So I imagine you would need some sort of framework to be able to reproduce this, right? Because I bet that this changes often. So you're looking at a piece of content that is somewhat volatile, in that probably when there's something big that they want to promote, they switch this out. Right now, we're talking about building a better web together, but I imagine they will change this. So you want to be thinking about something that is sort of nimble, right? And that you can change easily in terms of this particular piece of content.
It's interesting. There are two adjectives there, right? There was volatile and nimble. And I suppose when something's volatile, you need to be nimble to avoid the explosion that comes when the volatility happens.
Yes.
But yeah, so yeah, we've got two bits of text. We've got a link with link text, and we've got an image. So we could dive in and start building a hero component. But honestly, if we scroll down again, we see two new components side by side here that seem different.
Pretty similar.
Well, but like, yeah, I was going to lead us there, right? But
oh, okay, sorry.
But yeah, that like at a design glance, right? We've got a rectangular image as opposed to this kind of floaty image. We've got a button. We got card style. So like in my code, I'd be looking at a different component style, right? Like this would
Yes.
be a card component as opposed to a hero component. But since you spoil it, why don't you go into why maybe that's not
Yeah.
the case?
But from a content standpoint, you have the exact same sort of field types or elements, right? We still have an image, we have a title, we have a bit of text that's more like a paragraph style text, and we have a button. So, what has changed is sort of the design and the configuration of this. These are essentially smaller heroes, but they're cards in a different format because they're meant to be placed next to each other, right? Maybe sometimes we see this often. These are quite big, but it's the homepage, right? But sometimes you see these sort of card like elements, and there are like several of them in a row. So on its sort of at the granular level and on the base level, right? It's the same elements that we see at the top in the hero.
And I suppose before we scroll down again, I think that's an interesting philosophical point too, where we start talking about what what makes a headless CMS important and what makes it different from a monolithic CMS. And that is this idea that our content doesn't have to be fully tied to our design, right?
Right.
So we have these two things that if I were just breaking this down from a design perspective, they are two different things. But from a content perspective, they are the same. And that means that we can craft an editor experience that allows somebody to think different, think the same about them and get a different outcome. Or even if they want to, right, we could have them move this component up to here and it would just work in theory, which is great for a page builder. Even though a page builder feels like it's very tied to the design, really it should have these pieces that can be interchanged and moved around however it needs to happen.
Right. And that's sort of the beauty with headless and content modeling, right? Is that from a content perspective, you can create these repeatable content patterns that are independent of the design. So, just as you said, um, these cards down at the bottom under the hero, you could easily switch out, learn how modern web technology can help you succeed. And that if that was meant to be the main focal, that could be switched as the hero. And then what is currently in the hero can come down into a card format because this, is a repeatable content pattern and it's separate from the design. So once you get to a presentation layer, you can then take these content patterns and sort of transform them into whatever they need to be design wise. But the content itself remains the same.
And here's a message from Romina, who I love working with for this very reason. Editors don't
Yes.
need to think
Hi,
about design
Romina.
consistency in headless. Exactly right on that. I mean, editors will almost always think in a design mindset because usually they're writing or editing for specific areas. However, consistency in, let's just say, form building, like since really what we're doing in making our model is also building our content editing form, allowing an editor to feel the same on that and understand how each of the fields works, even if it's in a different spot, I think is also really, really interesting as well.
Yes.
And actually, I'm going to Ramina's on fire today in chat. Also, if new channels are used, created content can simply be delivered there without needing to be adapted first. Absolutely.
Yes. We'll get into a little bit of that later.
Yep. In fact, I'm going to inspect something real fast. I'm kind of curious about this image because I'm wondering, I think it might be a transparent PNG, and I think this circle would actually just work out of the box without a white background up here. I think they've just crafted it in a way that would work in that specific way as well.
I see.
I think it's interesting, at least. All right, let's scroll down and kind of keep looking. And I'm seeing more familiar ideas down here, Lo.
Yes. So we have a slightly different appearance, right? But again, what do we have? We have an image, we have a title, we have some text that's like a paragraph, and we have a button. Slightly different configuration, right? But still kind of in this like card format. But when I look at this, what I see is perhaps more of a collection of things. but this is me thinking in terms of content modeling. So when I look at this particular section, the content elements are the same, but maybe this looks more like actual like articles, and I'm getting like a brief summary of that article, but again, still the same elements and, you know, basically the same repeatable content pattern.
Yep. And actually, when we're looking at the URLs that are provided here, we have a blog post here in the middle. We have, I don't know what baseline is, but it is, oh, it's a conference, looks like. And then we have the CSS podcast. And this one is actually a link off-site, which is interesting as well. These two link on-site, this one links off-site. But it's definitely like this idea, this collection of promotions as well.
Yeah. So you could think of this as, yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? We just don't, because this is the type of site it is, I immediately jump to products when I think about promotion, but this is a product, right? They are talking about a product. This is product of learning information and, you know, their various content collections that they offer.
And speaking of which, even more content collections down below, where we have this other thing. And this one, now, Lo, this one looks completely different. It's 100% different. So you got to tell me that this is a different content model, right?
Well, I want to tell you the truth. So
honesty is important.
I'm going to say that it's not that different, right? We have what we have is a heading. And then we have that text that's a descriptor. The thing that is missing here is an image, right? But the great thing about sort of content modeling and these sort of repeated patterns that we're talking about is for a new content section, right? You can choose to leave off elements when it doesn't work for that particular area. And here we have a collection of what appears to be things related to CSS and UI design, right? So we have some maybe perhaps blog posts or articles as a collection under this sort of subject matter, right? And because you maybe want to put in more of these or to de-emphasize them less, images are not appearing. They chose not to put images here. But again, still the sort of same repeatable content pattern, a title and a text sort of description or brief sort of excerpt or summary.
Yep. Then we scroll down and it's all that until we get down to the form at the bottom, which I think we're going to avoid talking about for the moment. And then we get to the footer, which we will also avoid talking about. So this is the homepage, a landing page that, while we haven't talked about like how we would build these like components out, does seem to function similarly all the way down in terms of content model. But I also kind of want to go a little bit further before we content model this page and think about where we're sending people from this page. And a lot of it, if we avoid the more like advertorial pieces, right? A lot of the content that lives on this site appears to be article focused, right? So we've got
very much so.
We've got adding typography to user preferences in CSS. And then we can see here, it is a fairly basic blog post style. But it exists here, which is in the articles. We even have breadcrumbs. But I would wager, if I were building this, we have all these navigational items up here that, what is the difference between a blog and an article? And from a philosophy perspective and from a content modeling perspective, Lo, what do you think there? What's kind of your idea around what these differences would be?
So in my mind, they're not very different, but perhaps a blog is more time related. Is usually how I think about this, right? That a blog is maybe time oriented and it's something that is happening now, or usually geared towards perhaps announcing a new thing. But maybe an article is something that is meant to be more foundational, substantial, something that is going to exist as far as your content goes for a long time. So let's say it's like a tutorial, perhaps, or maybe an article that is providing some foundation of knowledge, right, or learning that isn't going to change much. But that doesn't always have to be the case. That's just how I tend to think about it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also say. I mean, we looked at this together yesterday. That at the very bottom of the article, we do have the fact that this does have an updated time on it. It does have the updated date on it. I wish they'd done some formatting work around it, but that's another story. But the idea on this would be even an article that's evergreen, like the web changes, like these standards change. So eventually, this might need to be updated to showcase a new aspect of web typography. So
Right.
you at least want to like potentially know that it takes that into account. But I think it's probably, you're right, less important than perhaps a blog post style, which is, I mean, well, let's go to the blog real fast.
Yeah, let's take a look.
So let's see. I mean, they're announcing web.dev for China, which means they're doing translation work. That's an announcement, right?
Right.
Immutable array updates with array.prototype.with. That's a new method in JavaScript. So yeah, again, an announcement. Interop 2024. That's an announcement of a conference. Interaction to next paint becomes a web core vital. That's an announcement. This is very announcement focused. And you can see even on this page itself, they display the date. But let's look at
Right.
articles real fast. The articles landing page does not.
Not.
So again,
Yeah.
your assumption there is absolutely correct in that one, the date is more important than the other. Because yeah, you wouldn't want to see Interop 2024 after it's already happened and be like, oh, I thought I was going to be able to go to it. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But again, when we're talking about differences and similarities, there's a date on both, and when we click into it, other than being short and having no table of contents on the right because it's
Contents.
short, the model itself is pretty much the same.
It's pretty much the same, right? We got a title, we have an author, which I assume is Paul there, and their social media links, and then we have sort of the body or the actual, copy of this particular blog post. And then we have we have like a was it helpful?
Oh yeah.
Sort of to give feedback, and then we have that sort of last updated at the top, at the bottom, and very similar to what's happening inside of an actual article. We have those same sort of elements.
But you can see,
Again,
ooh,
we have
I chose an even bigger one accidentally, where there's
yeah,
this other sidebar as well, because this is actually deeper in the site in other places as well,
yes,
which we perhaps won't talk about the information architectural elements there, but another interesting case on the fact that this is the same content model as the other articles and the same content model potentially as the blog post, but used in a
exactly.
different way.
Exactly. And you can see sort of how from these sort of articles, they started to sort of scale out into other areas. Just like, so this article is sort of connected to this explore section that they have, which gives you, I assume, once you go, you land here, right? You get some base information, and then you can use these sort of side menus to delve deeper into that particular subject.
See, now I'm kind of curious. Okay, it's not here, but yeah, there's probably something in one of these that corresponds to measure performance in the field, right? Like this
Right.
area in the
Exactly.
sidebar, which I can't select. I've been highlighting text across the board and I can't highlight it here. But yeah, so like this area here, this article was embedded in that section, therefore it gets this sidebar in one of probably a couple of different ways, but the article itself is the same.
Exactly. And then if we go back really quickly to either the article sort of index line, here we go. We see again, we have this repeatable pattern of this card and hero, right? What do we have here? We have an image, we have the title, and then we have a brief sort of summary or description of what this particular article again. So we're seeing this pattern show up quite often in terms of the content that's being delivered on this site.
Now
Go ahead.
let's take a short break and let's think about this for a second too, because we have this, right? It has an image, a title, and a description that is the article's image, title, and description. Let's even see if the title comes through. The title is here, but when we go back to the home page, we do have things that are technically not articles that follow this too.
Right.
So this is where we have to start thinking about volatile versus like domain content, right?
Content, right.
This is a very volatile section. But this is actually not volatile, right? Like it's just flowing into this page from the articles. And we wouldn't want to force an editor to go to a separate place to build out the article list, right? We'd want to probably build this into our article itself.
Yes, because again, we're talking about, content that is sort of going to remain and is stable. Like maybe you have to make some minor updates to it, or if the piece of tech you're writing about, for instance, changes in some way, you might need to correct something in this, but it is stable. It's not sort of transient. It's going to remain here.
Yeah. I think that makes looking at the homepage even more where was the homepage? Instead of clicking the logo, I just decided to go through my history. In looking at this, and when we're thinking about it, this top section feels very volatile. It feels like it's something that you'll want to add in the content to this area. These sections, because they are, let's see, this is offsite and this is on-site. So that means that we want this to be volatile as well. We can't just pull everything from on-site. Same for this one. But I feel like when we get down here, these article. Oh, y'all can't see that. I'm sorry. I'm hovering and I'm getting the URL, down in the browser, but apparently that's not popping up on stream. All four of these are articles. So that means that this description probably needs to pull from the article.
Yep.
So why don't we do?
Go ahead. I was just going to say, so probably inside of, if you had a model for this, right? What you would see there is some kind of field for like an excerpt or summary, right? So that would always be sort of attached to the article.
Yep. You know what's ridiculous, Lo? I set things up before the stream and I just happened to hit the timeout and I was logged out. That's how streaming luck works.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
I feel like that's a good segue to actually doing the content modeling, right? The content modeling in HighGraph for this. This is actually a blank HighGraph project. There's nothing built already. And so if we were given this project, before looking at the homepage, like when I think about content modeling, I'm usually thinking a little bit more atomically. Like what is the main items that everyone's going to be entering? And in this case, that's probably articles, right?
Articles, yes.
So let's add an article model. And let's figure out the pieces that we need for the article. And I'm now kind of wishing I'd shared my entire screen and not the Chrome browser, because I could put things side by side, but I think we can just look
we can and
go back and forth. All right, so let's look real fast. Actually, I was hoping to like do this kind of like slightly backwards and be like, oh no, we don't have an excerpt. But in looking at this, do you think that's the excerpt from the homepage?
I think so. Right? Let's
see. Hold on. Let me copy this and see if but it's not. Okay, which one did I click?
You click new CSS colors.
New CSS.
It's right above the subgrid.
Okay, so this is that here. It is.
Is that the same? Yes.
But I accidentally clicked on CSS subgrid and it doesn't have an excerpt.
Have that.
So now I'm a little bit confused. But anyway, if we're doing this from our perspective on what is good content modeling and not thinking about other things that have happened, we have a title and we have an excerpt. Obviously, that was going to the homepage as well. So let's go ahead and add those in.
Yeah. And I have a theory perhaps why that other article does not have an excerpt or summary, but I'll get back to that when we actually build the model.
Nice. So let me ask you, because this is kind of an opinion question. I started making a title field because that's the way that my brain works. But then I put on my editor cap for a second. And do you think an editor thinks in titles, or do you think that they think in headlines?
Let's see. I think that it depends, right? And this is a good sort of way to talk about who should be involved when you're building your models, right?
Yep.
So in this particular case, right, I would consult, as a developer, I would consult some of the authors, right? And specifically ask them, what do you call it a title? Do you call it a headline? Do you call it something else? And the great thing about being able to sort of build your own content models and sort of in the headless space is that you can fully customize the experience to developers, right? Or to developers and editors. So as a developer, you can fully ask your editor, and you should ask them, how do they refer to the sections of their content when they're writing an article? What do they call different pieces, so that you can build that directly into the model, so that when the editors come to create their content, they are in a space and working with a form that is familiar to them because it's using their vocabulary.
And in fact, we can customize it for both audiences at the same time, because I, as a developer, I think that this is probably a title, right? And so by default, as I type in headline here, my API ID changes. But that doesn't have to be the case. What if everywhere in my model and everywhere, like maybe in other sections that we don't have right now, I want to call everything title because it's the page's title. It's a whole bunch of other things around that. So I want my API to have titles, but I want my editors, perhaps after I've talked to them, to have headlines.
Yeah, you can totally do that.
And then we'll select that this is a title field, and we're not going to localize because that's its own stream at some point.
Yes, we'll get into that another time.
And we said we need an excerpt. And so in this case, we have to think about what kind of excerpt we want. Is it plain text or is it rich text?
Do you want to know my personal opinion?
Absolutely.
My personal opinion is plain text, right? Because this is really meant to be maybe 1 to 2 sentences at the most, right? And you don't really need any other things that come with sort of rich text for this. You just need those 1 or 2 sentences. They're not going to be headings in this, any of that. So I would use plain text for this.
And I think this is where we can talk a little bit about protecting your editors and protecting your users at the same time, right?
Yes.
If I were to give my editors a rich text here, honestly, they could put headlines in here because that's what our rich text allows for. They could also put links in here. And I don't know that I want links to be in here. I think from a user experience perspective, or maybe from a business perspective, I want somebody to read, not jump
and remain on the remain where they are, right? And so don't immediately give them incentive or motivation to leave.
Yep. And so I think for safety, as well as for, the use case is just a couple sentences, right? I think multi-line plain text string is absolutely what we want here. That being said, at some point, right, somebody might request, I want to be able to do multiple paragraphs in here. And multi-line string is not going to do that. It's not going to do paragraphs for you. But that's something then you have the conversation and figure it out. And also, that's why you talk to your editors in the first place anyway, like we've kind of been saying.
Yes. Because it could be them wanting that is to solve a specific problem that may need to be solved in a different way rather than sort of changing what this excerpt field looks like, right?
Yep. And I put a little description in here to help our editors out.
Excellent. Yes.
Simple content that goes before the article and is listed on list pages. And again, we can workshop that later on to make it good in-app documentation for our editors.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to
And I
skip
feel like
over.
people, real quickly, sleep on the description, but it's super important because it's what your editors see. So if you want to sort of quickly input some general guidance or instruction about what that field is supposed to do or how you're supposed to use it, that is the place to do that.
Real fast, I'm going to open up a new tab and we'll actually see we'll be able to see the content field in this excerpt. And here's that description that we wrote. So it's right there, ready to go, and available to us. Now let's, for the moment, skip over author, but let's keep a mental note that we need to come back to it. And
yes. Real quickly about this excerpt, right? So when we looked at that other article, we saw that it didn't have one, right? So I suspect what happened is this field is perhaps available in this particular model or this particular construction of how this content is, but it's not required and it's sort of optional. You can add one if you want, and you can not add one. But perhaps it might be better to make something like this required if you want consistency across your content. So if you're building your model, for instance, and you say all articles should have an excerpt, you would want to plan that into your model, and you can do that by making the excerpt field required. So this means that if you are putting in an article as a content creator, you have to complete this field. And that's one of the ways you can sort of build in even more guidance into your model, and why content modeling is so cool, because you can generally control the consistency of your content and your data, right? Both in terms of not only the content consistency of your front end presentation, but the sort of content and data consistency of your API.
So, Lo, I just got a fictitious request from our fictitious stakeholders on our fictitious project.
Okay.
And that is, they want the excerpt to show here, which I think is actually what's happening here, but they want to not have it show here. So,
okay.
What's going to make the most sense for that? I've got some thoughts, but I'm kind of curious your take on that, because they really, like you said, data consistency. We need the excerpt, right? As developers, we need the excerpt to be able to make our list pages. But how do we make it so that they can turn that off?
So I think in terms of thinking about this from an overview perspective, right? Is the excerpt needed more times than not? And is this a one-off in terms of presentation? Because if it's a one-off in terms of presentation, we don't want the excerpt to appear in this place. This is something that you would deal with on your front end. So you would just hide it for this particular case. Or I would include the excerpt in the model, but perhaps you might also use like a Boolean or something, on or off. So that's how I would solve this, because it seems to me, looking at this, more times than not, we do want the excerpt. And if that's the case, include it in the model, and then build in ways to control whether or not it actually that content actually appears on a front end presentation. So maybe, like I said, yeah, you could have like a Boolean, like excerpt on or off, or something to that effect. But if it appears more times than not, include it in the model. And it seems like it does. So I would, no matter what, include the excerpt in the content. And I would still make it required, because what happens when it this again, we're talking about content that is sort of stable and evergreen, right? So what happens when it moves off the landing page and it goes to the index? You're still going to want to have that excerpt, right? So that's why you put it in the model. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And honestly, like I am not having any experience with web.dev, right? Other than being a reader of it. I'm very
Right.
curious about the design constraint that actually one article out of the 6 that I clicked on did not have the excerpt on it. I'm kind of curious as to what the conversation was for that, but that's not
Yeah.
not in scope for what we're talking about right now. Um, so yeah,
Yeah,
we've got
there's a lot of things like on the homepage, even not to distract us. There is one content section that shows a list of articles that doesn't have a button. So I
right.
also wondered about that too. Like, why do all the rest of them have a button and that one doesn't? But we don't know. We're
And
not
it's something
privy to
I'm
those
passionate
conversations.
about. Let's have a CSS
Yes,
button,
me too.
web.dev. Let's have a CSS button. Um, Neither here nor there. But yeah, very curious about like that sort of like content methodology there. Um, so yeah, I think the couple other things that we want to think about are let's get back to this one. We've got a rich text field. I think I clicked you. Um, and
Yep.
for the moment, because I think it would get into the weeds a lot, although I kind of want to build this at some point. We
Yes.
have probably rich text embeddable things here, right? We got browser support, we've got code blocks, and we have images, which images aren't on this one, but I saw it on one of the
Yeah.
other ones. So for now, we're going to pretend we're in an ideal world and we're going to make the content area. Now, I've seen this in 2 main words, Lo. I've seen content and I've seen body.
Yes.
What kind of thought do you have on the naming of this one? For me, I want the API to say content, but I don't know what the
So that makes sense. If you want the API ID to say content, you should defer to the developers who are going to be maintaining and using this, right? But for the display name, I'm going to say again what I said about the other field, which is talk to the people who are actually going to use this. Do they refer to this as content, or do they refer to it as the body from an editorial standpoint, noting that this is the meat of actually what I'm trying to communicate in this particular section? So again, you really want to talk to, as you're building out your content models, you really want to have the people who are actually going to use it, the editors, the content creators, involved in the model making process. Or that could be, you also want to have even subject matter experts, right, depending on what your model is for. But this is the best time to talk about this is while you're building it, and not after the fact, when people come to you and say, well, actually, this isn't really working, or the name of this is confusing. Some of the editors or some of the subject matter experts don't really recognize this immediately as a thing that they're supposed to complete, or how to really navigate it, because it's not in their vocabulary.
and my favorite thing here, right, is that this is probably not hugely important for a very simple article model. However, like if you do anything slightly more complex than this, you can confuse the heck out of your editors. Like
Absolutely.
it'll be relatively obvious what's going on to the editor after the first couple training sessions on this one, but like on other ones, on other things that are more complex, names are important. I'm actually going to call this article body. I think that's going to be as explicit as my fictitious editor might want here. I talked to them. They said article body is what they'd like to see there. Or
Excellent.
the great thing on this, right? This specific use case is, even though web.dev is an open source thing and they're probably powering all this via Markdown somewhere. Uh, Imagine a system where you have contractors that come in and write like a couple dozen articles and then leave eventually, and then you get new contractors in writing more articles. You have to train them on a regular basis on a site like this. You have multiple people working in it. So
Exactly.
I'm gonna say my editor in chief, right, like my big editor who knows all the contractors, is the one that told me they'd like to see article body for this. Um,
Right. And maybe, like you said, if they have a lot of contract editors or contract content creators, woo, that was a lot of C's.
yep.
um, like this may also fit into whatever their training manual or their onboarding looks like, right? So if
Yep.
they're, for instance, in those onboarding instructions referring to this as the article body, then they would want to also have this inside of their content model that the contractors are going to use, right? And to sort of further illustrate this point really quickly, like, so for instance, how this can be very complex. My partner is a scientist and they do an extensive amount of research with lots of different people, right? So they work on plants. So they work with plant breeders, they work with plant pathologists. So considering if you are building a content model for other scientists to enter in data, and they have to work sort of together, you would really want to contact them and get them involved in this process as subject matter experts to make sure that the field types are in a vocabulary that everybody understands.
Yep. Here, we're low on time, but I think all these conversations
I
have been
can't
like super
believe this
important.
much time has passed
I know it's
already.
ridiculous. But now that I'm like thinking about, right, like I kind of want to see, like I think we could make another piece of content out of this kind of idea. Like let's break up web.dev and let's talk through with fictitious, stakeholders and talk through the things that come in. Anyway,
Yes.
article body, I've enabled embedding because I know at least I need images. Eventually, I'd want to see other embed types here, including like the browser support and the code blocks and all of that. But for now, let's just do assets so we can keep things moving.
Yep.
Now, here's an interesting question for you, Lo. And
Okay.
this goes into power and complexity. We know, because we have our specification, right? Our design doc and whatever it was. We know that we need a date and we need it to be potentially last updated. But we could do that in a lot of different ways inside of HighGraph and in fact, probably other systems as well, because we have this idea of system fields. So
Yes.
we have this idea of a published at, we have an updated by, we have an updated at, we have a created at. So we have all these dates that automatically happen within the system. Do we want to use those for our content model, or do we need to explicitly put some sort of date field to let our editors worry about that? And again, I'm a pause for a second and say, we're going to talk to our editors, but I'm calling you my editor in chief right now. So what would
Okay.
you like to see here?
Now, okay, so then I have a couple questions, right?
Yeah.
Um, are you just literally displaying or want the content of when something is updated? Or is it a case of potentially that created date needs to change? So it may not be, maybe you put an article in and you wanted to say it was created 2 months ago or 2 months from now. So that those are relevant, I think, considerations, because if it's just going to be sort of a literal, we're putting the date stamp of when this was the last time it was updated, I would use a system field, or the last, date, you know, of time it was updated at, system field. If it is a situation where these dates need to be controlled by the editing team, then you want to put a date field in there.
So I'm going to look at my design. I'm going to say this very much, especially since it's like in UTC and it's like numeric and all that. That feels to me like it's a system field.
Yes.
In fact, if I had to guess, this is probably a markdown document in GitHub somewhere that the last time this file was updated is actually what imports in there. That's my guess as to how it's actually set up.
Right.
So I'm going to say that sounds like a system field to me, but I think that is an important consideration. Do your editors need to control that? And with the control of it comes the complexity of the editing experience.
Exactly.
All right. So we will say that we will use system fields for that, and that saves us editor overhead, right?
Right. And what's interesting about having those fields, right, is that you can still control sort of when you connect this to a front end, you can control what that looks like, right? So you could have, for instance, with that system field, because it has a published by, um, you could have this article was last updated by at this time, and
Mhm.
actually sort of use those system fields to actually have it a little bit more readable than what's on
Yep.
down at the article of the web.dev thing.
And like it's also like I'm like, okay, well, the author was Rachel, right? Who's an amazing CSS person. Was it last updated by Rachel, or was it last updated
Exactly.
by somebody who made an editorial change? Like that's when we start getting into like if we start thinking from like a docs perspective, like I would love to see like the history and why these changes were made. Like, could we have a field that is like
Exactly.
that scope creep? That's not what's built into the site, but like that's an interesting concept.
Right.
Um,
But it does set you up to ask those questions and think about that later, right? Which
yep.
is what you want in a content model.
Now we also have this, which
Oh,
is not on everything. I do think I saw it on one of these. So that post doesn't have it. Subgrid maybe. Yeah.
yes.
So this also appears to be an embed. So I'm not going to do that today, but this looks like a call out that we could potentially have, and maybe all these colored boxes are of a component type of call out. Like that's a
Yes.
possibility. Um, and I'm not seeing it really anywhere else. I'm seeing it at the top of the page. Oh, we have one down here.
Oh, wait, I saw a purple one, I think.
Yeah, I saw something. Yeah.
There we go.
So again, like if we were to model this out, we'd have this. This is rich text because we've got code in here. We have an icon, and then we probably have a style type for it.
Right.
Not
And
blue,
you
but
have
like starred or something. I don't know.
SARS. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're or by information type, right? Because it seems like is this like I would want to know like what is the intent behind these, because are they like when they're doing icon and green and then that mini title, is that consistent across always used for this type of call out? Because
True.
maybe you would want to build that into the model.
Yep.
Like but it seems to be varying depending on what's there. There doesn't seem to be any, you know, at least uniformity that I can readily pick out that's but you could build that consistency into your model. Like green is always going to be like a pro tip, or blue is going to be the pro tip. And it's always going to have the title pro tip with, I don't know, a light bulb, which I think is what we have on our site. That's
Yep.
why I'm
Exactly.
thinking of it. And that call out is always going to be additional pieces of information that help you along through like a tutorial, for instance. But you could build that into your model where you have the content person maybe select from a drop down even, right? Because call outs are going to be these
Yep.
consistent types, and they choose pro tip and then they put in their information. But that's getting into maybe some components.
Yes. And I just wanted to point out, I actually have an article on this specific use case. I love this use case. I love subgrid, but it's from like 3-4 years ago now. Anyway, let's go back to our original article. And I think technically, if we avoid those components for the moment, the only thing that we need for the article view, I'm gonna speak very, very quickly now because I want to talk about one more big thing before we let everyone go. We need an author. And so Lo, I, as a completely uninformed content modeling person, right? First of all, time
Mm-hmm.
out. I'm gonna put my author as information on this page. I'm gonna put an author name. I'm gonna put an author social. I'm gonna put an author bio on my articles. Is that right? Is that good?
It could be, but then I'm going to ask you what happens when those same people are needed to be attached to a different model or different type of content, right? So that's again the thing you need to ask yourself about content modeling. Are these particular things going to remain here in this model and only in this model? If the answer to that is yes, always or most of the time, maybe you put it in that model. If this is potentially something that could be attributed somewhere else, it probably either needs to be its own model or component.
I fully support this. I'm going to make us a new model that is our author model. So we can talk about that a little bit. And we didn't get nearly into the things I thought we were going to get into.
No, because we didn't have the person. We haven't even talked about the person model type versus an actual author type, right? Because what if you just have the people attached to the website? What if they're not always authors? What if there's something else? Maybe you want to be able to assign them as an author. You can get really into this.
Well, and then we have to talk about like guest authorship, and then like there's all sorts of stuff.
Exactly.
I'm going to pretend that I feel like this should be clickable because I'd love to have like an author landing page.
Right.
So let's put a slug. So we've got that, and again, let's have this be slug, and let's have this be I don't know. I don't know what an editor really wants this to be. We'll just have be slug. Let's not have that conversation.
Yeah, because I feel like there's also room to have things like this. There's room to also bake in education about this too, right? Like, as developers, like sometimes we build things and then we just kind of hand it over, but a little instruction and onboarding goes a long way. So if you sort of write up a quick manual and do a little bit of training, you can just say the slug is synonymous with a URL. This is where the address of where this content is going to live, essentially. So,
and in fact, in doing that and having that quick conversation, because this is all we needed to have the content of the page, we forgot a slug on this. We need a slug for each of these as well.
Oh, yeah.
Which, if we were doing like progressive disclosure on all of this, like there's other things that we need on it as well, like an image for when it's in a list view and stuff like that, which we were totally going to get to about 5 to 10 minutes from now when we're not going to be streaming anymore. So one of the things that we do need in here is a social media idea, and for the author, right? So we'd have like this idea of socials, and then I'm going to say social cis because I think that's fun. And so this is a component because it's going to be the same potential structure for everyone, and we want it to be a repeatable pattern on each one, but we want it to be potentially unique. Well, actually, we could step in. I'm just doing this real fast because I think it's an interesting thing to talk about.
I do too.
We could have an enumeration, which is our types of social that we allow for. And then that controls the front end for those icons so that user is not picking an icon. So we'd have social types. And this is one where we actually don't have to worry too much about the editor because the editor is not going to be here. The editor is going to be editing on another field. So we'll say Twitter, we'll say LinkedIn, Facebook, Mastodon, and something, right? I don't know what the something else is, but whatever that is.
Maybe,
We would come back and add in, anytime we allowed for a new one, we'd add it in here. And then on the socials, we would have a couple of links or a couple of pieces, right? We'd have the profile link.
Or
URL or link. What do you like better?
I think maybe link, but you could use URL for the API ID if you wanted.
True. Oops. All right.
Because this also sets us up. Not every author, for instance, is going to have all the links, right? So you would want them to be able to choose the actual links, social links that they need to fill in because those are the accounts that they have.
Yep. And so this time we're going to have a social platform. It's going to pull from the social types enumeration. We're going to allow multiple values. And that's going to allow us to add in multiple of these per author, which just has currently a link in the social platform. We could extend that if we needed to in some way later on. But then when we go back to our author and we're speed running now, we're going to add in that component as a basic component, social platforms. And here we'll actually, no, we didn't need to allow multiple values on the other one. We allow multiple values here.
Values on the component. Yeah.
So we'll actually go back to our component and fix that because that actually would be a problem. That would, oh no, we can't. We'd have to redo it. Oops. We'll pretend like I did that correctly. So now we have name, slug, and social platforms, which is all that we saw. We might eventually want, a rich text for a bio if they have a page.
Right. So then let's look. Can we look at that from the content side really quickly, just to see what an editor would?
We need the avatar too. But yes,
Oh.
yes. So are you wanting to see the author or the article? I guess the author. Right?
The author, yeah, just so we can see really quickly like what that sort of drop down and what that looks like when an author goes to add their social links, right?
Oh, hit the wrong button. And again, I shouldn't have been able to save that, right? That shouldn't have been savable at that point. But yeah, so now I've got my author page that has my name, the slug, and this. And in fact, I guess we wouldn't want to hide this from the editor, but I could potentially hide that from the editor if it worked behind the scenes. And then we need to be able to have our author on the articles as well.
Right. So we need to go back and add that to the model.
Yep. And so we need to allow only one model to be referenced. Allow multiple. No, we only want one because we want this to be the author. And then this is a two-way because I want to be able to query from my author page. The editors don't need to worry about that. And then we do want multiple authors per article as well, because I saw that on one of the other articles.
Yes, because then you can always have co-authors.
Exactly. And then we can configure both. So on the, let's see, we want the authors to be here, but then on the author model, I don't actually want to list these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this one API only.
Yes.
So
which is another great thing about this, right? You can choose what to show and what to hide in terms of content modeling and particularly in HighGraph, right? Yep. Because you want to remove clutter that's not needed and give your authors or your editors an experience that is really tailored to what exactly they need to come in and do, and only that. So they don't need to think about these other pieces. They can just come in and be creative and work on their pieces of content.
So now Brian Robinson has an article in the system, but the article list doesn't show here because we don't want to clutter up this view. This view doesn't need to see it.
Exactly.
But the API needs it. And that means I can query in the API for this author and get all of their items.
Their socials. Yeah. And one thing I will just say quickly, because I know we have to go, in looking at that, when we decided whether or not in terms of references to allow many authors to an article, even if I hadn't seen that, if I were building this model, I would use that option anyway, because again, the great thing about content modeling is it sets you up to be able to scale. So theoretically, right, it is more than reasonable to assume that I would have co-authors for an article eventually. So you would want to and can plan for that in your content modeling.
And the fun thing is, right, this is one of those moments where there's a tiny extra bit of developer work that you have to do, but it future proofs it. Like you'll have to, instead of just getting a single author, you will have an array of authors coming in. And that means that you have to do a loop. Oh no, you're going to add 3 lines of code, but it's an important 3 lines of code so that you can make it. If you needed to change this later on, because of the way all this works behind the scenes for performance reasons and all sorts of other things, you would have to remove this field and add a new one. And that means a content migration, and ain't nobody got time for a content migration for adding authors.
Nobody. So that's not the way.
Put it in from the beginning, and you'll be much happier long-term. Yeah. So we're 4 minutes over, but here's the thing. I think that this sort of conversation around modeling is an important one. And at some point, I've got this idea that I really want to do content model improv. I think it'd be a really fun kind of event.
Yes.
Where we take stuff from the audience and okay, yeah, sure. We'll talk about this random topic and really get nerdy about it. So yeah, if you're interested in that, do let us know, and I'll do our various calls to action here. If you are interested in that as an idea or learning more deeply about it, come hang out with us in our community, ask questions about content modeling. We're in there, slack.highgraph.com as where you can go for that. If you liked what you saw in terms of how we're doing the content modeling in the system, obviously HighGraph is what we're doing it within. So app.highgraph.com/signup, or just come to highgraph.com. That's fine as well. And we actually have a whole bunch of documentation around modeling written by the amazing Romina, who was in chat earlier.
Hey, Romina.
And there's specific stuff around all of the fields we're using and all the additional fields that you can use to do the content modeling, as well as some like how-tos and philosophical things linked to our documentation there around some of the things that we talked about as well. That's not the technical aspect, but more of the working with your editors and your developers together.
Yes, the methodology, if you will.
Yeah. Any parting shots before we go, Lo?
No. Happy content modeling.
Happy content modeling, y'all. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.